Thank you, Boaz, and to my very distinguished colleagues on the panel. This is a great group, and as you said, I'm very proud of the cooperation between Maxwell and Herzliya and ITC. This has been a great experience for all of us, and I look forward to even deepening that as we go forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the American perspective on these dramatic events that are taking place in the region, and I want to begin with two caveats, which is first, I'm going to focus, as the topic of the panel is, which is on the perspective of these developments through the lens of the implications for radicalization, radical Islam, and terrorism, with the understanding that the U.S. interests and perspectives in the region are much broader than that. We're not talking about nuclear questions or proliferation. We're not talking about economic and other issues as well, which matter a lot to U.S. policy in the region, but rather focusing on this particular, albeit extremely important dimension. And the second point I'd like to emphasize is that I'm going to discuss the debate in the United States, because there is not a single U.S. perspective on these issues. And I suppose I should say as a third caveat that I'm speaking for myself and not for the administration which I previously served in. I would say that there are probably five main strands, or five different narratives in the way that Americans tend to think about and debate the developments in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, or whatever appellation you want to give to it, as seen from the perspective of the implications on terrorism, and particularly on the implications for the United States. The one which both Shabtai and Dan identified in their own talks is, I think, an important point of departure for some in the American debate, which basically saw that, if not the main reason for the rise of terrorism and radicalism, that at least one important element was the repressive governance in the region, and the sense that the non-democratic governance in the region contributed, if not the sole cause, to radicalization and the rise of radical Islam and the like. And that, therefore, the American strategy had to recognize this as an important source of the problem and, as I think Dan put it, get on the right side of history, recognize that if one was going to deal with the so-called root causes of terrorism, that one had to be supportive of the greater empowerment of the public's greater voices for the public and diverse voices within Arab and Muslim societies, and to try to get ahead of the curve by being supportive of those directions. Some may have had the very rosy view that Dan attributed, that Thomas Jefferson would emerge. Others, I think, had a more sober recognition that this would be a long-term process, but nonetheless believed that in the long run the United States would be better off and more secure by being on the side of the people, on the side of empowerment, on the side of the values that the United States had always stood for. The converse perspective is one that Shabtai identified in his remarks, which was that this was all a terrible mistake, that in fact the United States was far more secure when there was strong governance in the region, powerful government actors that could deal forcefully and effectively with the sources of terrorism, and that rather than being a product of these more effective and controlling and somewhat dictatorial regimes, that in fact they were the principal line of defense for the United States. And it was the very erosion of governance, the very erosion of strong state control, strong security controls that have contributed to the increased threats both within the region and to the United States itself. And therefore the United States should be more sympathetic to, for example, the return of the military in Egypt, and be more supportive of strong regimes. This has, at least in a relatively small number of cases, though I think it's quite a rare perspective in the United States, is even extended as far as wondering whether we were better off in the days of the Assad regime in Syria, with the emergence of new threats as state control has disintegrated in Syria. A third perspective, which is an important part of the U.S. debate and is certainly reflected to some extent in the President's most recent West Point remarks, is a belief that one had to distinguish the different kinds of threats emerging from radicalization and the potential for terrorism between those elements, particularly the so-called central al-Qaeda threat, which were directed and explicitly focused on causing harm to the United States, and the broader phenomenon of radicalization, and including terrorist groups which were anathema to perhaps American values, but did not pose a direct threat to the United States, and that the United States needed to focus, as the administration has done, on debilitating, decapitating the central al-Qaeda forces, but with a lesser concern about other radical movements, even those which employ terror tactics. A related perspective, a fourth perspective which informs at least the views of some as they look at this question, is the idea that in some ways the problem of the terrorist threat to the United States is a product of our own deep engagement in the region. This is a very favored view of many of my academic colleagues who believe that it's precisely because the United States has become so deeply involved, particularly in the Middle East, over the last 40 years, and our presence in holy places like Saudi Arabia and our deep engagement up to and including our engagement in military operations in the region has, in fact, caused increased radicalization, and so focusing less on our direct support of repressive governments and more on the U.S. Military presence in the region, have suggested that by winding up the wars and reducing the American presence in the region and particularly our military engagement in the region, that we reduce the danger to the United States, the sense that we will be the object of the anger of radical groups and terrorists, and by coming back home, that we will reduce the threat to the United States. And of course, like all good narratives, this one has its own converse, which is a view that quite the opposite, that unless the United States deals with these forces of terror at their source before they come to the United States, that we will find that over time that these forces become stronger. And just as we saw the evolution of the al-Qaeda threat from bin Laden's days in Sudan to his leadership in Afghanistan, that it was our failure to act early and effectively at the early stages of these radical movements that pose a threat to the United States, and that rather than withdrawing and playing less of a role, the United States needs to be more active and more engaged in dealing with these threats, whether they are in Syria or in northern Africa, before they metastasize and come home to roost in the United States. Now, obviously, there are two different elements of these competing narratives. One element is a theory of the case, that is, what is causing radicalization that leads to terrorism. In some cases, viewing this as a product of the United States' own strategies, in some cases seeing this as the kind of forces that Dan and others have talked about, which is broader trends in the global environment and the role of religion in the environment. But how you interpret the sort of underlying causes obviously has a big impact on the strategy that you would advocate. But some of the debate obviously is about tactics itself, which is to how deeply involved should the United States be, how much should we view this as our problem, and indeed how should the United States define its own interests? Should we be limited in our concerns to those radical groups that directly threaten and explicitly threaten the United States, or do we need to be concerned about those who threaten friends, who espouse values and strategies which are inimical to our broader principles, although they may not pose a direct threat to the American homeland or to Americans themselves? And I think you can see in the President's own remarks, particularly in the West Point address, at least how the administration is beginning to conceptualize this, which is to recognize that while the United States has to deal with direct threats to the United States from radical groups and terrorist organizations, that we should be cautious about broadening the scope of American engagement, both to include groups that don't directly threaten the United States and to have the United States at the forefront of that fight. And so you see in the address both a focus on distinguishing between central al-Qaeda and the splinter groups, and also what might, I think, not unfairly be characterized as a sort of Obama and Nixon doctrine with respect to terrorism, which is to empower and help others fight radical groups within their territories, but not take this on as a central threat to the United States. And I think, too, if you look at the administration's debate over how to deal with the problem in Syria, the deep concern, which clearly influenced many of the decisions made by the administration about uncertainty about what the opposition stood for or how the opposition might use military assistance that might be provided to it, reflected a caution and a belief that sometimes, even when well motivated, that U.S. engagement could have the opposite impact, a kind of remembering the lessons of Afghanistan coming home to roost, and a fear that that would happen again. But as in all debates in the United States, some of it is partisan, some of it is not partisan. There are those who have quite a different perspective and believe that it's precisely by the United States playing less of a role by stepping back from this that we enhance the risks to the United States. And I think that one of the things that is important to reflect on here, and perhaps can be part of our discussion here, is these are important debates in terms of how the United States should think about the problem, how we should posture ourselves. Should we see ourselves as pursuing a democratization strategy as part of our counterterrorism strategy, or do we need to focus on stability and order and be prepared to step back from the values-based arguments that have been an important part of U.S. foreign policy throughout our history? But it's also, I think, and I will end here where Dan began, with the necessity of being humble. Because the reality is that however you come out on these debates, the one lesson I think that comes out of the last decade or more is a certain humility about how much impact the United States will have on this problem, irrespective of which of these theories of the case one adopts. That is to say, whether or not we believe that promoting democracy and individual empowerment is the best strategy for dealing with terrorism, or whether we believe that the forces of order should be supported, it's not obvious how much the U.S. engagement here will decisively tip the battle. And that, as we've seen in Egypt, however the United States postures itself, the forces on the ground, in my judgment, are, for the most part, somewhat more powerful, at least in the near term, than anything the United States should do. The fate of Mubarak, in my judgment, was not determined in Washington, but was rather determined in Egypt itself. And while the United States has a responsibility to take a position and to have a view, to say that our role is limited does not mean that we can simply step away from the problem. But it also, I think, should lead us to think about the fact that we need to adapt our tools and our focus to those places where we can and should make a difference. And I think that begins with understanding those places which our colleagues have talked about, which is how do we partner with other countries. And this goes beyond just the question of providing training and technical assistance to counterterrorism forces, but how do we develop joint strategies that will allow us to deal not just with the tactical problem of terrorism, but these broader political forces that are sweeping through the region. Because I think the United States has a lot that we can do and must do, because our interests are deeply implicated here, but that we are going to be more effective, both more legitimate and more effective, if we find a way to partner with others who share our objectives, which is to create a region in which the values of democracy and individual rights can prosper, but not in ways that either lead to the kind of totalitarianism that Dan talked about, religious totalitarianism, or provides safe haven and safe spaces for radical groups to cause harm to others. And I think that's a tough problem going forward, especially at a time when the United States is weary of war and weary of engagement in the region. But I think if we step back too far, it's pretty certain, at least to me, that every time we've done that, we've come to regret that sense of disengagement and recognize that the failure to engage when we still have the time and space to do it has often led to much more costly interventions at later stages. Thanks.